As Democratic Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries addressed lawmakers and members of the 119th Congress on Friday, his acknowledgement of Donald Trump's presidential win had a telling reaction from GOP lawmakers.
2 months ago, the American people elected Donald Trump as the 47th President of the United States of America. Thank you for that very generous applause. It's okay. There are no election deniers on our side of the aisle.
Shout out Brooklyn. Tomorrow, on January 6th, Congress is set to formally certify Trump's win at the U.S. Capitol. And on the same day in the same building where 4 years ago, a mob of insurrectionists attempted to take control and to overturn the election results by force. Now, in 2025, physical reminders of that day have largely faded. Inside the Capitol, you won't find scars on the walls from the thousands who converged on January 6th while waving Trump flags. There's no plaque or remembrance of the attack. Instead, we have videos like these, many of them which came from the rioters themselves. We have these images of protesters breaking windows and storming the halls of the Capitol, even trying to take over the House floor as lawmakers and their staff huddled for safety. And we have these chilling sounds, this terrifying chant targeting then Vice President Mike Pence. Multiple people died, both during and after the riot. More than 140 police officers were injured. Condemnations of the attack were swift and came from members of both parties. That night, we heard this from Senator Lindsey Graham, who had been a staunch ally of Trump since he won in 2016.
I hate it to end this way. Oh, my God, I hate it. From my point of view, he's been a consequential president. But today, first thing you'll see, all I can say is count me out. Enough is enough.
And then the next day, Trump himself even shared this video to social media.
I would like to begin by addressing the heinous attack on the United States Capitol. The demonstrators who infiltrated the Capitol have defiled the seat of American democracy. To those who engaged in the acts of violence and destruction, you do not represent our country. And to those who broke the law, you will pay.
But soon there were these little and then these big shifts in the narrative around what actually happened on January 6th of the recent trauma everyone in this country had just lived through. Some Republicans started floating the idea that the protesters at the Capitol weren't right-wing or even Trump supporters at all.
Now, there were likely not all Trump supporters, and there are some reports that Antifa sympathizers may have been sprinkled throughout the crowd.
I don't know if the reports are true, but the Washington Times has just reported some pretty compelling evidence from a facial recognition company showing that some of the people who breached the Capitol today were not Trump supporters. They were masquerading as Trump supporters and, in fact, were members of the violent terrorist group Antifa.
And then another theme emerged, downplaying the violence of the insurrection.
It was not an insurrection, and we cannot call it that and be truthful. If you didn't know the TV footage was a video from January the 6th, you would actually think it was a normal tourist visit.
With a straight face, a normal tourist visit. And finally, there was the transformation of the insurrectionists from lawbreakers to patriots and martyrs.
We will treat those people from January 6th fairly.
A bipartisan January 6th Select Committee was assembled to hold public hearings on the events of January 6th. Members presented even more documentation of the violent attack in an effort to ensure accountability and transparency. And Special Counsel Jack Smith was tasked with leading his own investigation of Trump's role in the attack. The Justice Department also took actions against the rioters. The DOJ has since charged more than 1,500 people with crimes stemming from the attack on the Capitol. But here's the thing. Despite the indisputable evidence, despite these detailed investigations and prosecutions, By 2022, an NBC News poll found that less than half of Americans considered Trump solely or mainly responsible for the January 6th attack. The full-throated GOP campaign to rewrite history largely worked. When Trump began campaigning again for a second term, there was a clear talking point repeated over and over again by anyone serious about joining his administration.
On the election of 2020, I've answered this question directly a million times. No, I think there are serious problems in 2020. So did Donald Trump lose the election? Not by the words that I would use.
It all went back to the big lie. Do you believe Donald Trump won the 2020 election or not? That was the barometer for getting into Trump's inner circle. It is a blatant erasure that we cannot stand to forget, as the new administration is just 15 days from taking power. Last month, President-elect Trump promised to pardon rioters in the first hour of his term. These are the same people who were already tried by the DOJ and convicted by the government. And Speaker Mike Johnson said House Republicans will set their sights on the January 6th committee itself for having the nerve, the audacity to investigate an attempted insurrection that happened in front of all of us in plain sight. In a new essay for the New York Times, Aquilino Gonell, a former sergeant in the Capitol Police, said he's still haunted by the events of that day, which pushed him to ultimately leave the force. He wrote, quote, "I resent the ongoing whitewashing of the barbarity and collective amnesia of right-wing politicians who aren't willing to hold Mr. Trump accountable. I can't bear to hear Republicans describe themselves as the law and order party." The hypocrisy here is by design, and it not only undermines the significance of the threats to democracy that were exposed that day, it also erases and minimizes a moment that looms over our entire political system. 4 years later, as Republicans would love for Americans to get on board with their historical rewrite, or at least move on from it, we cannot sit back and allow the continued normalization of the insurrection. Joining me now to discuss this is April Ryan, White House correspondent and Washington bureau chief at The Grio, as well as an MSNBC contributor and the author of Black Women Will Save the World and Anthem, and Ryan Wiggins, chief of staff for the Lincoln Project. Thank you both for being here to kick off the second hour of Amen. I want to start with you, April. Your response to some comments that President Biden made this afternoon to a reporter talking about the significance of January 6th tomorrow. He said, I think it should not be rewritten. I don't think it should be forgotten, but I don't think we should. If you noticed, I reached out to make sure there's a smooth transition. We got to get back to basic, normal transfer of power.
President Biden is president for the next few days, and he wants a smooth transition. He does not want the remnants of January 6th, the residue of January 6th, 4 years ago, to be a part of his legacy. You have to remember, okay, President Biden is trying to stay above the fray. But for those of us who work in Washington, those of us who were there or reporting on it, remember vividly. And you cannot negate January 6th, because January 6th was, in fact, an effort to keep Donald Trump in office and not let Joe Biden come in. If those persons who were rioting that day had done what they had planned, Charles, I don't even know if we would be in these seats right now. It would look different. It would smell different. It would taste different. This was not a tourist attraction tour, a visit of people with a picnic basket with those red and white checkered tablecloths skipping through the halls of Congress. These were people who had bear spray, who had bats, tens of thousands of people who had backpacks who could not make it through the Secret Service checkpoint because they had things in their bags, okay, when the president was speaking on the ellipse. But they moved on over to Capitol Hill. And President Trump watched it. He told them to ultimately, at the end of the day, to go home. And he even said this defiled democracy the day after. And now the switch It's so interesting to hear the people who were running to safety, trying to run from these people who are going to do God knows what. People who erected a gallows for Mike Pence, the sitting vice president at the time, because he certified the votes against his own president or a new president. I don't know what more. I just think the president is trying to move on and keep peace. This president, Joe Biden, until January 20th.
Very difficult to manage doing that, but also keeping in mind an accurate depiction of history. And Ryan, speaking of that accurate depiction of history, I want to talk to you about some of the hypocrisy that we're seeing from the GOP. In a moment where you have actual January 6th rioters who have come to the light and said, you know what, I was duped. I was there. This was a mess. You still have Republicans and some lawmakers who are heralding them as heroes and patriots, even against their own narratives. These are folks who were there, who've been convicted and tried, who have said now, you know what, this was wrong and it should not have happened. How do you square that? And there are other narratives as well. Just we saw some of the switch and change in positions of other lawmakers, including Donald Trump. How do Republicans square that in a way that's reconcilable for anyone who's paying attention?
So, Charles, I'll tell you, I'm a Southerner, and Southerners know that football is religion, right? And so I think that you have a lot of these people who are actually looking at their politics like they look at their football team. Well, it doesn't matter if my team cheated this year. It doesn't matter if my team did this, as long as we get to the national championship football game, right? And I think that people have got to stop seeing something as vital as our government and the politics that operate within our government as something as silly as a team that you just can't turn your back on.